In Hollywood history, John Wayne was known for one thing above everything else. In 179 films across nearly 40 years, the Duke never broke. Not during gunfights on screen, not during brutal filming schedules, and not even during the cancer battle he faced while filming his final movie, The Shootist. But one afternoon in October 1976, a crew member opened Wayne's trailer door and saw something no one had ever seen before. John Wayne was crying. Before he was the Duke, before the cowboy hat, the gravel voice, and the legend, John Wayne was simply Marion Morrison. And the person who knew him best in those early years was his father, Clyde Morrison. Clyde wasn't a Hollywood man. He wasn't a producer, an actor, or anyone connected to the film industry. He was a small-town pharmacist. But long before audiences across America knew the name John Wayne, Clyde Morrison believed something about his son that few others did. That he was meant for something bigger. Marion Robert Morrison was born in Winterset, Iowa. In 1907, years before Hollywood would even become the center of the film world. His father Clyde ran a pharmacy and tried to give his family a stable life. When Marion was still young, the Morrisons moved west to Glendale, California, hoping for better opportunities. Life wasn't glamorous. Money was tight. Work was unpredictable. But Clyde had one rule in his house. You showed up. You did your job. And you didn't complain. Those values stayed with Marion his entire life. As a teenager, Marion was tall, athletic, and fiercely competitive. He earned a football scholarship to the University of Southern California, where he played offensive tackle. For a brief moment, it looked like his future might be in sports. But a shoulder injury ended that path. Suddenly, the young man who once dreamed of football had no clear direction. So he took whatever work he could find. That eventually led him to the edges of the movie business, working as a prop boy and extra on film sets in the late 1920s. At the time, Hollywood wasn't interested in Marion Morrison. He was just another tall kid hoping someone might notice him. But someone was watching. In 1929, the same year Marion signed one of his first small film contracts, his father Clyde wrote him a letter. It wasn't a long letter. It wasn't dramatic. And it certainly wasn't written with the expectation that anyone else would ever read it. It was simply a father writing to his son, encouraging him, reminding him to stay grounded, and telling him that no matter what happened in Hollywood, he would always be proud of the man his son became. Years later, that letter would become one of the most personal things Wayne ever kept. Because in 1937, when Marion was still struggling to establish himself in Hollywood, Clyde Morrison died. He never saw his son become a star. He never saw the westerns. He never saw the moment Marion Morrison became John Wayne. The transformation happened in 1939, when director John Ford cast Wayne in the western film Stagecoach. The film changed everything. Overnight, Wayne became the face of the American Western. Over the next 4 decades, he would appear in 179 films, building a reputation unlike anyone else in Hollywood. On screen, he was fearless. He rode into gunfights. He stood his ground against impossible odds. And he rarely showed weakness. The image became so powerful that people began to believe it was who he really was. A man who never cried. A man who never showed doubt. A man who never broke. But behind the scenes, there were a few things Wayne kept close to him. Photographs of his family, personal notes from old friends, and somewhere among his belongings, a letter from his father written in 1929. By the mid-1970s, Wayne had already become one of the most recognizable actors in the world. But in 1976, while filming what would become his final movie, The Shootist, something about him seemed different. Crew members later remembered small details. He spent more time alone between takes. He moved a little slower. And sometimes, when filming paused, Wayne would quietly step away to his trailer for several minutes at a time. No one asked questions. After nearly 40 years in Hollywood, people simply assumed the Duke was resting. But one afternoon in October 1976, someone opened that trailer door and saw something that had never happened on any John Wayne film set before. October 1976. Production on The Shootist was nearing its final weeks. The film was already unusual for Hollywood, and everyone on set knew it, because the story mirrored real life. In the film, John Wayne played an aging gunfighter named J.B. Brooks, a man quietly facing the end of his life. Off-screen, Wayne himself was battling cancer and dealing with the physical toll of decades in front of the camera. For the cast and crew, the atmosphere on set felt different from any Western Wayne had made before. Quieter, more reflective, almost as if everyone understood they were witnessing the final chapter of a career that had defined Hollywood for nearly 40 years. One afternoon during filming, production paused between takes. It was a normal part of the schedule. Cameras needed adjusting, lights had to be reset, and actors often used the break to rest. Wayne usually spent those moments joking with the crew or leaning against the set walls, telling stories from decades of filmmaking. But that day was different. Instead of staying on set, Wayne walked slowly back toward his trailer. No one thought much about it at first, until a makeup artist, checking to see if he needed a touch-up before the next scene, approached the trailer door. She knocked. No answer. Assuming he might not have heard, she opened it. And then she stopped. Inside the trailer, Wayne was sitting alone, not rehearsing lines, not resting, just sitting there quietly. In his hand was a folded letter, and tears were running down his face. For a moment, the makeup artist didn't know what to do, because in all the years people had worked with John Wayne, across 179 films, no one had ever described seeing him cry on set. Not during injuries, not during personal struggles, not even during the physically brutal productions of his earlier westerns. The Duke was known for many things, but vulnerability was never one of them. The room stayed quiet for several seconds. Wayne noticed her standing in the doorway. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Then Wayne calmly folded the letter in his hand. He wiped his face with the back of his sleeve, stood up, and placed the paper back inside the breast pocket of his jacket. No explanation, no apology, no story. According to later accounts from crew members, Wayne simply nodded once and said something that sounded almost routine. Ready when they are. Then he walked past her and headed back toward the set. Within minutes, filming resumed. Cameras rolled. Wayne stepped into character again, delivering his lines with the same quiet authority that had made him one of Hollywood's most recognizable stars. If anyone noticed anything unusual, they didn't say it. And Wayne never mentioned the moment again. Not to the director, not to the crew, not even to the actors working beside him. The letter stayed exactly where he had placed it, inside the pocket of the jacket he wore during filming. Production eventually wrapped. The Shootist would be released later that year. It became Wayne's final film. To audiences watching in theaters, nothing seemed unusual. They saw the Duke one last time, strong, steady, and unshakable. But somewhere behind the scenes, a single question remained unanswered. What was in that letter? And why had it affected Wayne so deeply that, for the first and only time anyone could remember, the toughest man in Hollywood had broken down in tears? The answer wouldn't come for 3 years. Not until 1979, when Wayne's son began sorting through the belongings his father had left behind. And inside one jacket pocket, he found something that had been waiting nearly half a century to be opened. June 1979. 3 years after the release of The Shootist, the world lost John Wayne. News of his death spread quickly across the United States. Newspapers called him the last great cowboy of Hollywood. Television networks replayed scenes from his most famous westerns. Fans gathered outside theaters, showing his films one more time. But while the public mourned the legend, Wayne's family was dealing with something quieter. The personal task of going through the things he had left behind. Among the people helping organize Wayne's belongings was his youngest son, Ethan Wayne. Inside closets and storage trunks were pieces of a life that had stretched across nearly 5 decades of Hollywood history. Old scripts, production photographs, film jackets, and hats worn in westerns. Some items were valuable pieces of movie history. Others were simply personal belongings Wayne had kept for years. One of those items was a jacket he had worn while filming the Shootist. At first glance, it looked ordinary, but when Ethan checked the inside pocket, he felt something folded inside. Carefully, Ethan pulled the paper out. It was a letter. The envelope was worn with age, the edges slightly yellowed, but the paper had been folded neatly, as if it had been placed there with care and never removed again. There was a date written near the top, nearly 50 years earlier, and the name at the bottom of the page belonged to someone Wayne had lost decades before. His father, Clyde Morrison. For a moment, Ethan just stared at it, because this was the same jacket his father had worn during the filming of the Shootist, which meant the letter inside it might be the same one Wayne had been holding that afternoon on set in 1976. The letter no one had ever seen opened. Here's the part of the story no one knew until years later. The letter Wayne had been carrying during the filming of his final movie wasn't new. It had been written nearly half a century earlier. In 1929, the year Marion Morrison was just beginning to chase his dream in Hollywood. And the words inside weren't written to the legend the world would one day know as John Wayne. They were written to a young man still trying to figure out who he was. When Ethan unfolded the letter and read the final lines, he discovered something deeply personal his father had carried with him for decades. A message from a father who would never live long enough to see his son become the Duke. And one sentence in that letter suddenly explained why. On a quiet afternoon in 1976, John Wayne had sat alone in his trailer with tears in his eyes. When Ethan Wayne unfolded the letter, he realized almost immediately that what he was holding wasn't just a piece of family history. It was a message that had followed his father for nearly 50 years. The paper itself was fragile with age. The ink had faded slightly, but the handwriting was still clear. It was the careful script of Clyde Morrison, written at a time when his son was still just beginning to search for his place in the world. This wasn't a letter written to a movie star. It was written to Marion Morrison, a young man standing at the uncertain edge of adulthood. In 1929, Marion had just started working around Hollywood studios. His acting career hadn't taken off yet. In fact, most of the people around him still believed the film industry was just a temporary job. But Clyde Morrison saw something else. In the letter, he wrote about pride, about perseverance, about becoming the kind of man who stayed true to himself even when life became difficult. He didn't talk about fame. He didn't talk about money. Instead, he focused on something much simpler: character. According to family recollections later shared over the years, the letter encouraged Marion to keep moving forward, even if success took longer than expected. Because sometimes the most important journeys in life take decades to fully unfold. Toward the end of the letter, Clyde Morrison wrote something that would quietly stay with Wayne for the rest of his life. It wasn't a dramatic sentence. It wasn't poetic or grand. It was something deeply personal from a father to his son. The final line read, "Whatever you become, Marion, I'll see it from wherever I am." For most people, that might have been a touching message from a parent. But for Wayne, those words carried a different weight. Because when Clyde Morrison died in 1937, his son was still struggling to build his career. His father never saw what happened next. He never saw Stagecoach, the movie that would transform Marion Morrison into John Wayne. He never saw the westerns that followed. And he never saw his son become one of the most recognizable actors in American film history. Over the decades, Wayne's career grew into something enormous. He worked with legendary directors like John Ford. He starred in films that defined the American Western. And he built the image of a man who never seemed to show weakness. But somewhere behind that public persona, Wayne kept certain things private. The letter from his father was one of them. For nearly half a century, it remained among his personal belongings, quietly preserved, never displayed, never discussed publicly, just something he carried with him through the long journey from struggling actor to Hollywood legend. By the time Wayne began filming The Shootist, he already understood something about the story he was telling. In the movie, his character faces the end of his life with dignity and reflection. Off-screen, Wayne himself was confronting many of the same thoughts. It was the final film of his career. And, perhaps, in those quiet moments between takes, Wayne found himself thinking about the long road that had brought him there. From a young man named Clyde Morrison in 1929 to the actor the world knew as John Wayne. Somewhere during that reflection, he opened the letter his father had written decades earlier, the one that had followed him through every stage of his life. And for a brief moment in that trailer on the set of the Shootist, the toughest man in Hollywood allowed himself to feel something few people had ever seen: gratitude, memory, and the quiet presence of a father who had believed in him long before the world ever did. By the time Ethan Wayne finished reading the letter, the room had gone completely quiet. What he was holding wasn't just a message from his grandfather. It was something far more personal, a reminder of a relationship that had shaped the man the world would eventually know as John Wayne. The letter had been written nearly half a century before Wayne filmed his final movie, The Shootist. And yet, somehow, it had remained close to him all those years. Through early struggles in Hollywood, through the moment his career finally took off after Stagecoach, through decades of westerns, war films, and the long path that eventually turned him into one of the most recognizable actors in film history. Wayne never spoke publicly about the letter. He never mentioned it in interviews. He never told reporters that he kept it with him. But the evidence was simple and undeniable. When Ethan found that jacket from the Shootist, the letter was still folded carefully in the pocket, exactly where Wayne had placed it. For Ethan, the discovery answered a question that had lingered for years: why his father had always seemed to carry certain memories quietly, why there were parts of Wayne's life that he rarely spoke about publicly, and perhaps why that moment in the trailer during the filming of The Shootist had been so powerful. Because by 1976, Wayne understood something few actors ever fully experience. He knew his career was coming to an end. He had spent nearly 40 years in front of cameras. He had appeared in 179 films. And he had become a symbol of strength for millions of people who grew up watching his movies. But in that quiet trailer between takes, he wasn't thinking about Hollywood. He wasn't thinking about fame. He was reading a message written to him long before any of that existed. A message written to a young man still searching for his path. By the end of his life, Wayne had built something extraordinary. His films had reached audiences across generations. His name had become synonymous with the American Western. But the letter showed something else about him that most people never saw. For nearly 50 years, he had kept a simple message from his father close to him. Not as a public symbol, not as a piece of Hollywood memorabilia, but as something deeply personal, something meant only for him. Today, pieces of Wayne's personal history are preserved by the John Wayne Cancer Foundation and by his family, who continue to share parts of his life with fans around the world. And among those memories is the quiet reminder that behind the legend of John Wayne, there was still a son who never forgot the words his father once wrote to him. For decades, audiences watched John Wayne ride across movie screens as the toughest man in Hollywood. He faced gunfighters, outlaws, entire armies, and in film after film, he stood tall without hesitation. But the moment that revealed the most about him didn't happen in front of a camera. It happened quietly, in a trailer, with a letter written by a father who had believed in his son long before the world ever heard the name John Wayne. Wayne didn't keep that letter because it was dramatic. He kept it because it reminded him where he came from. Because before the legend, before the westerns, before the fame, he was simply Clyde Morrison, a son who carried his father's words with him through every chapter of his life. So here's something worth thinking about. In a world that often measures success by fame, money, or recognition, what are the words that stay with you the longest? Who are the people whose belief in you still matters decades later? Sometimes the most powerful things we carry through life aren't awards or achievements. Sometimes they're just a few simple sentences from someone who believed in us when we needed it most. If this story meant something to you, leave a comment with one word that describes what John Wayne carried with him for nearly 50 years. Was it loyalty? Gratitude? Family? I read every comment. And if you enjoy stories like this, the hidden moments behind famous legends, make sure you subscribe. We share new stories every week. Somewhere, long before Hollywood ever knew his name, a father wrote a letter to a young man named Marion. And decades later, after a lifetime of films and fame, those words were still powerful enough to bring the Duke to tears. Because sometimes the greatest legends aren't built in front of cameras. They're built in the quiet moments no one else ever sees.